Disturbing things are happening in and around Arizona's Grand Canyon National Park. Seasoned guides vanish without a trace. Campers are driven from their tents in the dead of night. Tourists feel unseen eyes watching them from the trees. This episode will take you through 4 cases revealing the truth behind these experiences. A secret only recently revealed. I'm Josh Ninocchio. This is What Lurks Beneath. You won't want to miss this one. On September 2nd, 2006, a representative from the White Mountain Apache Nation stepped forward to share something with the public. Although her community's traditions and customs have kept this secret for generations, spokeswoman Colette Altaha said that the time had come to finally let the public know. Colette told Arizona's 3 TV news station that her people were not prone to easily talk to outsiders. In fact, because people doubting them before, most eyewitnesses never came forward. But now, Colette says that there have been more sightings than ever before. It cannot be ignored any longer. However, Colette isn't alone. Everyone else in the region has heard the rumors too, and over the years, those whispers have turned into first-hand sightings, both on and off the Fort Apache Indian Reservation. Colette's decision to speak publicly to 3TV was not made lightly. She even got some pushback from the community she represented. Some members of the tribe voiced concerns over stepping forward, with some calling into the local radio station to say that this kind of exposure deliberately went against the wishes of their tribal elders. But Colette stood by her choice because she admitted that while she hasn't seen anything unusual herself, she grew up hearing stories all the time, and those stories came from people she loved and trusted. And even though she considers herself hard to convince, she'd heard enough to lead her to believe that those stories were in fact true. Tribal Police Lieutenant Ray Burnett supported Colette's announcement, and he said that admitting the truth was simply a matter of public safety. And he told reporters his officers often got calls from reputable citizens. People who they weren't crazy or suffering from substance abuse or even making prank calls. So whatever is happening in the mountains, the silence that once surrounded it is beginning to break, and for the first time, the world is starting to listen. But what was Colette referring to? Well, the Fort Apache Indian Reservation sits around 200 miles from the north rim of the Grand Canyon, and in the American Southwest, that's practically next door. And the things that Colette warned the public about are directly related to some of the strange, disturbing things unfolding in the national park. At around 4 p.m. on June 2nd, 2015, 22-year-old river guide Morgan Heimer stood right near the Grand Canyon talking with the lead rafting guide of his group. The rest of the team was busy walking their boats back to the banks of the Colorado River, chatting and just laughing over the sound of rushing water in the background. Morgan and the lead guide were discussing how Morgan needed to take some time off that afternoon just to stretch his legs and clear his head. Well, at that moment, a client from the rafting group suddenly called over to the lead guide asking for help with something. The guide excused himself, telling Morgan that he'd be right back, and walked over to assist the client. The interruption couldn't have lasted more than a minute, but when the guide turned back around to resume his conversation with Morgan, Morgan was just gone. He literally vanished. The spot where he had been standing just moments before was completely empty. Now, knowing where this story is headed, this might sound alarming, but the guy didn't think much of it at first. After all, Morgan had just mentioned how he wanted to take a break, so he just figured Morgan had decided to take it early. But in reality, it was the last anyone would see of him. Morgan Heimer grew up in Cody, Wyoming, because his hometown was surrounded by wilderness. Morgan spent tons of time climbing, hiking, just exploring the outdoors as a kid and through his early adult years. He absolutely loved nature and became really adept at outdoor survival. He was also an experienced swimmer. And once he grew older, Morgan knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life. Although he majored in English at the University of Wyoming, he wanted to become a river guide. For a guy who loved the outdoors as much as Morgan did, getting paid to take people down beautiful rivers was basically a dream job. Eventually, he got hired by Tour West, who's a commercial rafting company that specialized in trips down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. Morgan wasn't just working a job, he was living his passion every single day. But on May 27, 2015, Morgan began leading what was supposed to be an 8-day rafting trip down the Colorado River. And for the first 6 days, everything went off without a hitch. The weather was perfect, the rapids were manageable for the group, and everyone involved was just having the time of their life. Especially Morgan, who was doing what he loved, guiding people through one of the most amazing natural wonders in the world. Then came June 2nd, the 7th day of the trip. That morning, the group packed up their overnight camp and continued their journey down the Colorado River. It was a day full of exciting pit stops, and by the early afternoon, they had reached a spot at mile marker 213 called Pumpkin Spring, where everyone oohed and ahed at the distinctive orange rock formation. And later that afternoon, with the sun beating down and a bunch of people in the group decided to go swimming in the Colorado River to cool off. For whatever reason, Morgan didn't join them. He stayed on shore, fully dressed in his river guide outfit, which was a dark-colored personal flotation device, a blue plaid long-sleeve shirt, flip-flop sandals, a maroon baseball cap, and brightly colored shorts. He also had this purple water bottle with him that he carried pretty much everywhere. And it was right after this swimming break that Morgan had brief conversation with the lead guide near the river's edge. That was the last time anyone would ever see him. Now, as I said, people assumed he was taking a break because guides sometimes took a little time for themselves during these long trips. But when the sun started setting that evening and the group gathered for dinner on the riverbank, they noticed something. Morgan hadn't shown up. And as it got darker and Morgan still hadn't returned to camp, people began getting really concerned. At 7:26 p.m., someone in the group officially reported Morgan as missing. Now, the local park rangers didn't waste a moment. They immediately initiated search protocols. The next morning, as soon as there was enough light, search and rescue teams began combing the river where Morgan was last seen, between mile markers 211 and 215. They literally checked everything: the shorelines, the water itself, all the rocky areas, basically anywhere a person might go, hide, or fall. They had helicopters flying overhead in teams with search dogs on the ground, but an initial search of the area revealed nothing. So, determined to locate Morgan, search and rescue teams expanded the search downstream all the way to Diamond Creek. The teams interviewed every single person who had been on the trip, asking tons of questions about Morgan's behavior, if he had said anything unusual or if they noticed anything. I mean, anything at all that might offer a clue as to where he went. But despite these extensive interviews, officials couldn't find any useful information about what might have happened to Morgan. The search continued for 6 full days. Teams worked from dawn until dusk, looking not just for Morgan himself, but for literally any sign of him that might lead to his trail. Maybe a piece of his clothing, that purple water bottle, footprints in the sand, or signs of disturbance in the vegetation that might show where someone had passed through recently. But folks, they found nothing. There was not a single trace that Morgan had ever been there. After nearly a week of intense searching without the smallest clue to go on, authorities had no choice but to assume that Morgan Heimer had most likely drowned in the Colorado River. But here's the thing. Everyone involved knew that Morgan was not only an accomplished swimmer, but that he had some serious outdoor skills. Like, unless he fell into some especially turbulent water, he wouldn't have just died from falling into the river. And if he was just lost somehow, he would have easily survived for a long time, long enough to be found. His disappearance simply defies all explanation. And sadly, to this day, Morgan Heimer's body has never been found. No evidence has ever emerged that Morgan was even alive after that afternoon on June 2nd, 2015. The experienced river guide simply disappeared in the Grand Canyon, leaving behind nothing but questions about what really happened. In the evening of August 29th, 2008, a law enforcement officer from the Phoenix area named Jim stood in the darkness on a remote road in the Kaibab National Forest. As his family watched, Jim cupped his hands around his mouth and let out a long, piercing howl into the darkness. Because standing beside him, his 19-year-old sister Jennifer waited silently for any response from the forest. But after the sound of his call faded, there was nothing. There was just silence. And so he waited a few moments and then let out another howl, followed by several whooping sounds. Again, there was no response. You've probably already guessed what Jim was doing. And no, he wasn't just a Portland, Oregon casual.
It's a Santa rat. I said the Santa rat. You wanna...
He wasn't just randomly making animal noises in the forest. In fact, for 17 years, he had been fascinated with Sasquatch, particularly in Arizona, and had developed specific knowledge about protocols used to attract and study these elusive beings. And this exact area near Crazy Jug Point on the north rim of the Grand Canyon was special to him because he'd had multiple related experiences here, including one significant encounter back in '91, about half a mile from where they were camping now. But Jim wasn't just looking for any Sasquatch. He was hoping to lure in the Mogollon monster, a bloodthirsty Bigfoot named after its territory along the Mogollon Rim, an escarpment cutting across northern Arizona. According to legend, the Mogollon monster is highly aggressive, venturing into campsites, tossing heavy stones at campers, decapitating deer, and maybe even kidnapping human beings. Its oldest recorded appearance was back in 1903 when it appeared to a settler near the Grand Canyon. As a testament to how dangerous this creature is, the eyewitness said that the beast was actually spotted drinking the blood of 2 mountain lions that it had killed. That's pretty flippin' metal. For local tribes like the White Mountain Apache Nation, the Mogollon monster existed long before 1903. I mean, it stretches back to their earliest tales, and at the time of Jim's experience in 2008, tribal spokeswoman Colette Altaha had already tried warning outsiders like Jim of the danger that the creature posed. But if Jim had heard the tribe's warning, he simply paid no mind. For this August archery hunting trip, he brought along his family, his sister Jennifer, his 30-year-old brother Bo, his 10-year-old nephew Roger, and 3-year-old daughter Caroline. They had set up their tent trailer approximately 60 feet away from the closest pine trees, which is an important detail for later, positioning it directly under an oak tree. Now their campsite was surrounded by ponderosa pines, small scrub oaks, and white firs. And after about 30 minutes of calling with no response, Jennifer was ready to be done. So she and Jim decided to head back to camp, and it was now around 9:30 in the evening when they got back. Jennifer took Roger and Caroline to the camp trailer to put them to bed, while Jim and Bo remained outside, sitting around the campfire, telling stories and catching up. It was the perfect place to reminisce about the past, quiet and peaceful and isolated. They knew for a fact that they were alone out there. There were no other campers within about 8 miles of their campsite. Well, Jim and Bo were already set up by the fire when, just as Jennifer and the children entered the trailer, a deafening sound broke the peace and quiet of the night. It had sounded like a large branch that had been violently broken or was stepped on, but it was extremely loud, and both men immediately tensed up, but tried to appear casual, not wanting to disturb their sister or kids. Jim glanced at Bo, who had clearly heard it too, but was also trying to keep his cool. After a moment or two, they just continued talking, all the while listening carefully for any additional sounds, and they're looking all over. For around the next 30 minutes, it sounded like their camp was being circled. They had detected movements from 2 separate unseen presences. Whoever these people or things were not trying to be stealthy at all. They were making loud, destructive movements in the trees. One seemed to be pacing from the northwest side of camp toward the east, while the second paced back and forth behind the camp trailer. Sometimes they heard smaller trees being shaken. Other times they noticed what sounded distinctly like heavy footsteps in the tall grass. They could tell there were two intruders because they heard both simultaneously from time to time, apparently doing different activities in different places at the same time. 10 p.m. rolls around and events escalated dramatically. The brothers didn't even have time to react, and by the time they heard the whizzing noise, it was too late. The first projectile, a sizable stick, suddenly landed on a suspended tarp next to the trailer set up to provide shade. Both of them just start staring at each other in alarm, not sure how to react, and then another landed in the camp, followed by another. And soon, Jim and Bo were experiencing an almost continuous volley of small rocks and sticks showering down on them, all landing at different points around the camp. The largest projectile was a rock the size of a softball that landed on the ground between the men and the camper. It was large enough and thrown with enough force that if it had hit them, it could have possibly killed one of them. But when it hit the ground, it made a loud enough thud that it scared both of them. Jim just looked at Bo and suggested they get inside the trailer like now. His brother agreed right away, and they quickly made their way to the door, constantly looking over into the dark forest, waiting for the next rock to come flying their way. Once inside, they were actually surprised to find Jennifer and Roger still awake. Caroline had gone to sleep, but their sister and the boy were sitting up, looking shocked. They told Jim and Bo that they too had been hearing strange sounds around the camper this whole time, and they didn't know what it was. So Jennifer demanded to know what was going on because it sounded like there was somebody outside. She described hearing footsteps behind the trailer throughout the incident, and at one point, she even heard what sounded like heavy sighing from outside. In addition to heavy branches breaking behind the camper and the rocks and sticks that were hitting the side. Despite these events, there was nothing to do other than hunker down for the night and lock everything up tight. The family tried to go to sleep, but shortly after turning off the lights, they noticed this loud, metallic thud. Jim's eyes flew open in the darkness, and he could feel his heart nearly beating out of his chest. And the noise had made everyone inside the camper jump, and they started talking among themselves, trying to figure out what it was. Finally, someone suggested that the sound had come from the sheet metal food box that they had placed on a small table just outside the trailer door. It sounded like something had knocked on the box or at least thrown something at it. Too frightened and exhausted to go check it out, most everyone fell asleep quickly, but Bo wasn't that lucky. He remained awake most of the night, later telling Jim that he continued to hear things being thrown at the trailer for a good time afterward. But eventually, he dozed off too. And even still, at some point in the early morning, he woke up again, and this time, he heard a new sound, and it seemed to come from a different direction than the others. And so he strained his ears and realized that the noise was coming directly above his head. Something was dragging what sounded like a branch across the canvas top of the camper, moving from one side to the other. Whatever was causing this sound was literally right above them as they slept. But even though these noises continued all night, nothing ever tried to actually break in the trailer or put its face in the windows, and eventually, by morning, Roger, Jim's nephew, was literally sick from nervousness from the night before. And in the meantime, Jim had noticed that another hunting group had moved in about a mile down the road, which gave him some comfort knowing other people were in the area. The day passed uneventfully, although everyone remained on edge, and at midnight, it began to rain and just never let up. Fast forward to the evening of Sunday, August 31st, Jim and Jennifer, feeling a bit braver with daylight and the presence of other hunters in the area, decided to try and make contact again. Firstly, they searched the campsite for signs or prints, but the ground around camp was covered with oak leaves and pine needles, making it difficult to find tracks. Mostly, the only evidence they found were small sticks and rocks, the same 3 to 4 inch sticks and small rocks that had been thrown at their trailer during the night. One detail that stood out to them, though, most branches and twigs hitting the trailer were from pine trees. Now, this was significant because the trailer was positioned under an oak tree, not any pine trees. This meant that whatever was harassing them had to have carried these pine branches a considerable distance before throwing them. Eventually, Jim and Jennifer walked down the road in the opposite direction from Friday's attempt and repeated their howling and whooping. But just like before, they received nothing in response. they were kind of grateful for that, actually. That night, the brother and sister returned to camp and joined everyone around the fire for a half an hour. Everything seemed peaceful with nothing unusual happening, and they all went to bed feeling somewhat reassured. But the ordeal wasn't over yet. Pretty soon, the sound of shuffling at the edge of the campsite started up. Then, too rapidly for anyone to react, the footsteps would grow louder. Thump, 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 until, bam! Something would grab the camper with tremendous force and just start rocking it side to side. And these weren't gentle movements. I mean, the entire trailer was being twisted forcefully in both directions. Jim personally felt this violent shaking happen 3 or 4 times throughout Sunday night. Each time, it would jolt everyone awake as the trailer rocked back and forth around them. The movements were far too violent and deliberate to be weather-related. Whoever or whatever was doing this had to have incredible strength. No one inside the trailer would move, so it wasn't just because someone was tossing and turning. Everyone was terrified out of their minds and just praying for it to pass. Bo actually ended up staying awake most of the night and later told his brother that he had counted 8 separate incidents when the trailer just went crazy. On top of that, around midnight, he heard something else, something he would describe as a low growl that lasted around 10 seconds. He said it sounded subtle but strong, producing deep vibrations that he could physically feel in his body. It was almost like the sound itself was shaking him slightly. By the next morning, everybody was relieved to not only be alive, but see the first rays of sunlight. By Monday, September 1st of 2008, the family had had enough. As soon as it was light enough to see, they grabbed everything, packed their belongings, and left for home in record time, not wanting to spend another minute there. What the family experienced over these few nights, unfortunately, remains a mystery. As frightening as the tales of the Mogollon monster may be, there are other, even stranger things to watch out for around the Grand Canyon. Early on the evening of November 19th, 1993, a hiker named Ted was walking from his campsite dorm to grab some food when something caught his attention. From somewhere off in the neighboring forest, he noticed this strange glow coming from behind the trees. But it wasn't just one color. It actually seemed to shift between a reddish shade, blue, and then yellow. Well, Ted didn't think much of it at first. He figured it was maybe just flashlights of some other hikers hanging out there, or maybe some dumb kids playing with colorful LED lights. But as the hours continued on that night, he just kept rethinking about how out of place those lights were, and how maybe it didn't line up with what he initially thought. By about 10 p.m., his curiosity had gotten the better of him and decided that, you know what, I need to check this out for sure. But he didn't go alone, so he went and recruited one of his friends for backup. Ted chose Luke Bigman, who was Navajo. Luke wasn't super excited about wandering into the forest at night to look for mystery lights, but after some convincing, he eventually agreed to tag along. Together, they left the dorm and headed toward the part of the forest where Ted had first seen the multicolored glow. And now, as they walked deeper into the woods, he noticed a strange sound, but it wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from his friend. Luke had quietly started chanting to himself in Navajo. Ted didn't understand a word of what his friend was saying, but he could tell the chanting seemed to make Luke feel a bit better about the situation. They continued to push onward, chasing the strange glimmer deeper and deeper into the timber, but before they even reached the hill where the light seemed to be coming from, both stopped. They were not alone at all. There, in the dim light ahead of them, stood what they could only understand as 3 smaller figures. They were shadowy, but Ted could tell that each one was short, maybe 4 or 5 feet tall at most, and all 3 of them appeared to be doing something on the ground, although it was hard to tell exactly what, with only the multicolored glow to see by. Both Ted and Luke are pretty freaked out, but for some reason, they decide to move closer for a better look. And in doing this, one of the figures moved, and it turned around and faced them head on. Even with the limited light, both men could make out that its facial features were almost human, but not quite. The thing in front of them had a completely bald head that was slightly larger than a normal human's, and its eyes were bigger than they should have been. The rest of its body seemed to be covered in something like a gray suit. Now that they had been spotted, almost instantly, the other two beings slipped behind some nearby trees, completely disappearing. But the one that looked at them just stood there, standing its ground, and just kept staring at them strangely. It finally moved again, turned around like the others, but was moving very slowly, as if it was trying to be very cautious, like it didn't know what Ted and Luke were capable of. Ted and Luke began backing up, and they hadn't made it more than a few steps before that multicolored glow that had been visible this whole time just disappeared, making everything darker. Simultaneously, they noticed a strange smell in the air suddenly. It was like this dry, sweet, burnt odor that neither of them had recognized. Both men, who were incredibly creeped out by this point, just continued walking backward until they finally reached the edge of the campsite parking lot. Ted and Luke both saw some other hikers there and ran towards them, and when they got close enough, immediately started telling them what they had just witnessed. As you can imagine, it didn't go well. These people just laughed and told them to lay off the booze, assuming they were drunk or on shrooms and making the whole thing up. Well, at that point, all that was left was to go to sleep. The next morning, despite being pretty shaken and annoyed that no one believed them, Ted couldn't just let it go. At the first opportunity, he went back there himself, determined to find some sort of proof. He managed to locate what seemed like the exact spot where the light had been. And while the glow was gone, he surveyed around and spotted something else. There were 4 distinct impressions in the ground, like something heavy had been sitting there or had landed there. Weirder still is that scattered around the area were handfuls of burnt, reddish glass beads, and that strange, sweet burning smell from the night before was still in the air. But as for the strange intruders that had visited the Grand Canyon that night in 1993, they were nowhere to be found. With so many bizarre sightings happening around the Grand Canyon, it's almost surprising that there aren't more mysterious disappearances. One summer night in July of 1990, Carlos and his girlfriend Yasmin were returning home to Albuquerque, New Mexico from a trip to Los Angeles. The couple had decided to stop at the Grand Canyon on their way back, arriving late in the afternoon and deciding to stay and watch the sunset. After dark, they headed toward Flagstaff on Highway 180 as a shortcut. The road had very little traffic and wound through sections of heavy forest only about 15 miles from the Grand Canyon. They had just come around a bend in the road when their headlights illuminated something unusual. Walking along the right shoulder of the road ahead was a figure with its back towards them, but they could see that it was clearly walking upright like a human, so it had to have been a person. But even from a distance, Carlos could tell that it wasn't just a regular person or a hitchhiker or a jogger. I mean, it was much larger than any normal person should be. And the whole time he's trying to figure out who or what is that? Like, it's not making sense. And as he drove closer, Yasmin leaned forward in her seat, assuming that this was just a really large man. And then she started asking if it could be a bear because, bears do sometimes walk on their hind legs, even if it is for a short distance, but Carlos didn't answer. He was simply too focused on this figure, which he can now see was actually covered in brown or light brown fur. And in that very moment, he remembered something in his mind. He remembered something growing up. In Albuquerque, he had heard countless stories, hunting stories from his father, and he had told him all sorts of things. Some he believed, others he didn't. But those stories sometimes involved huge, hairy things in the woods, things that walked on 2 legs, things like Bigfoot. And whatever was walking along that highway matched those descriptions perfectly. Carlos immediately slammed on the brakes, but whatever this was now about 50 yards ahead of them. And keep in mind that it's now fully illuminated by their headlights. When the car came to a stop, it stopped walking too, and then turned its head slightly to look back at them over its shoulder. Then it completely turned its body around to now face their vehicle. And as you can imagine, both of them were silent. They were shocked. What they were looking at was between 7.5 feet tall. Its arms were hanging unusually low, and its entire body was thick and hairy, with an oval-shaped head that came to a clear point. This is when Carlos and his girlfriend got a pretty good look at its facial features. While its head and cheeks had hair, the fur around its eyes and nose and mouth was sparser. The face was ape-like, but seemed to retain some human-like features. And in the headlights, Carlos could see that its teeth, which were a dull yellow, and its eyes, which kind of had a slightly green glow like a dog's or a cat's eyes at night. But probably the most human-like, creepy thing about all of this was that it wasn't just blankly staring at them, it had an expression, one of confusion and curiosity, like it's looking at the headlights of the car and it's thinking, what is that? And the entire time this standoff is going on, they could see that this thing was intelligent and it was visibly calculating what is it going to do next. And as they watched it, it then ran its tongue across its upper teeth. And that alone just took Carlos to another level because he realizes, holy crap, am I looking at a human being right now? Like this isn't just an ape. This is something else. After a few more moments of no movement from anyone, it then took a brief step toward the car and paused. But Yasmin wasn't so calm. She began screaming in horror, and this scream caused it to react. It immediately stopped its forward movement, now very startled by the sudden scream, and what looked to be a completely panicked expression, looked around before turning and jumping off into the nearby woods. But it wasn't clumsy at all. I mean, it moved effortlessly, very smooth, and covered about 15 feet in 2 or so strides. Pretty much a boom, boom, gone. That quick. Within seconds, Yasmin quickly regained her composure, but insisted that they need to leave immediately. And she's screaming at Carlos, smacking him on the shoulder, saying, "Go, what are you doing? Put the car in drive, go!" But Carlos, as equally stunned, didn't feel threatened because he believed it had just been curious about what they were in, a car, but also he understood why she was so scared. And so they drove away, making a wide turn around the area where this thing had stood. It's interesting how it affected both of them in different ways. I mean, for Yasmin, this was traumatic. And even today, she refuses to ever discuss the incident, to the degree that her boyfriend believed she had psychologically blocked the memory to cope with her fear. But for Carlos, his perspective is forever altered. But it wasn't until May of 2005, 15 years after this incident, that he finally went public with his story. He did it partly as personal therapy, and partly because he hoped sharing might help others who had experienced similar encounters but were afraid to speak up. Whether it's a mysterious disappearance, a terrifying monster, strange lights in the woods, or a long-ignored tribal warning, the message is the same. Something ancient and hidden still moves through the southwestern wilderness, something untouched by time. The Grand Canyon National Park may draw millions of people each year, but stay on the paths because for anyone who strays too far, it offers more than just natural majesty. It seems to also offer a glimpse of what lurks beneath. And because you guys made it this far into the episode, I want you to all comment below the rim, so that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we deep dive into strange cases and accounts of the mysterious and supernatural, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next video.